Ann Archer Butcher, and I am a member of the Spiritual Awakenings International Board of Advisors. And I am the secretary of the board and happy to be here with you today. This is an exciting event. We're about to have a panel on balancing spiritual awakening, picking up perhaps where we just left off. And I want to introduce our first speaker, who is Katie Mottram. She is a leading mental health advocate and author with over 25 years experience. She's dedicated in her career to integrative, holistic, and transpersonal approaches into mainstream care. She has hinted to me that this may be a somewhat controversial presentation that she makes as the first member of the panel, but she is the co-founder of the Elephant Collective and hosts a community platform that explores non-ordinary states of consciousness. Please welcome Katie.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you everyone at SAI for this opportunity to share my research, and thank you to everyone here listening today. So I'd like to start today by just giving a little bit of context as to why I am so passionate and what led me to my research. So I was an existential questioner in childhood. I used to ask the questions kind of, why am I here? I felt like I was searching for answers. What is life all about? And I experienced some childhood trauma, and I repressed that unconsciously. And now I know more about trauma, I know that that would have really impacted me somatically. So I unconsciously repressed my trauma and stereotypically became the wounded healer and went to work in the mental health system to try and work out some of what had happened to me during my childhood. And it was whilst I was working on acute psychiatric wards that I started to question whether there was meaning in what gets called madness within the Western world. I was recognizing patterns in what the patients were talking about when they were talking about their experiences. They were expressing that they felt like they were God, that they were healers, and that sometimes they said they felt like they were dying. Because I'd repressed my own pain, the fact that I was kind of wearing a facade as a professional, but feeling so much pain inside and feeling so split from myself, led ultimately to my own breakdown in 2008, where I made a serious attempt to take my own life. I took up yoga and meditation at this point and kind of immersed myself into spiritual practices to try and help myself feel better. And it was during a meditation in 2012 that I experienced what I now know to be a spontaneous spiritual awakening. But had I gone to seek help within the profession where I was working, I probably would have been diagnosed with first episode psychosis or bipolar disorder, because my emotions were penduluming. All of my repressed trauma was coming up. I was having some really dark experiences, as well as some really euphoric, energetic states. And during this meditation, where I experienced this absolute freight train of a download of information, I started to write about theories that I'd never heard of before. And I'm going to read you a quote now from my book, something that I wrote at the time, which has kind of been my guiding force ever since. It said, "My message from the universe on the page in front of me told me that mental distress is a portal into self-actualization, providing a gateway into inner consciousness, to the core of our being. And it's only labeled as an illness because of how we've been conditioned to see it within Western culture." Now, I've been researching ever since then to try and make sense of that. So for the last 10 years, I kind of threw myself voraciously into exploring the intersection between mental health and spirituality. And about 5 years ago, I decided that I needed to ground my experience in academia. So I started a 3-year MSc in consciousness and transpersonal psychology with the Aleph Trust. Now, I chose to reframe my crisis as an opportunity to transform myself. And with that came a responsibility to start the journey of my own trauma healing. I don't believe it's something that we ever kind of get to the end of, really. It's a lifelong path, particularly whilst we're living in such difficult times within the world. And I really want to acknowledge the privilege in this. I think an integration journey is extremely difficult, and we can only really have access to this when we've got resources to integrate. So my passion and what I decided to research was trying to support the creation of a bridge between the growing edges of transpersonal psychology and mainstream psychiatry. So just to give you a bit of historical context of the literature, transpersonal psychology explores human experiences beyond what is considered to be usual self-conscious awareness, including a sense of a connection with an expansive, more meaningful reality. And a key concept, as we've heard, within this field is spiritual emergency. And spiritual emergency was coined by Stan and Christina Groff in 1989. And they talked about it being difficult stages of a radical personality transformation and a spiritual opening, which, if correctly understood and supported, can result in psychological transformation. The concept of differential diagnosis is based on Groff and Groff's idea that there's a delineation between progressive psychoses and regressive psychoses. And most research in the transpersonal field over the last 4 decades has upheld this differentiation. They talk about episodes of non-ordinary states existing on a wide spectrum, from purely spiritual states without any pathological features to conditions that are clearly biological in nature and require medical intervention. They say that it's important to be able to differentiate between spiritual emergencies from genuine psychoses. Now, I want to raise this issue of the validity of this delineation because there's a growing body of research within the clinical field, the growing edge of mental health, which looks at psychoses and the validity of that term, which we're going to look at a little bit more. So the Critical Psychiatry Network was founded by a group of concerned psychiatrists in the late 1990s. And they were concerned for the human rights of the people who were being labelled, because the construct validity of all psychiatric diagnoses has actually no scientific basis. They are social constructs. So there's no biomedical markers for any psychiatric labels, and that's quite unknown. This was also based on the concept of post-traumatic growth, which sees highly challenging life circumstances can lead to significant positive change if they are correctly understood and supported, as we hear about with spiritual emergency. More recently, there's been a move towards more trauma-informed conceptual frameworks, trauma-responsive conceptual frameworks, which move away from these hyper-individualized labels and the biomedical model, because we see manifestations of what get called mental illness as actually wise survival responses. And the nervous system is acting in order to save us at the time of the trauma. So it's really important to note that the etiology of psychosis remains unknown. We don't actually know what psychosis is, other than it's rooted in trauma. So one recent study into this field of leading edge research into psychosis aimed to develop knowledge into how post-traumatic growth occurs in experiences that have been understood to be psychosis. And Ing and her colleagues at Nottingham University, which is linked to the Institute for Mental Health in the UK, found that mediators of post-traumatic growth after experiences that were deemed to be psychosis found that people experienced more meaning in life, they had a change in their core beliefs, and they had a positive reframing of their experience away from diagnosis. They also experienced a personal identity shift and perspective and a worldview change because of this. Now, during my literature review, I recognised the overlaps between those mediators of post-traumatic growth after psychosis with what Brooke raises in her 2021 paper about the transformative effects of integration after a spiritual emergency. And these effects are alteration in disposition, character, and nature of a person, a permanent change in attitudes, beliefs, and behaviours. So you can see the correlation here. And although Brooke upholds differential diagnosis in her paper, she also raises this quote from Vierton and Scammer, which I think is really important, and they call for further research within clinical psychology, because disparate types of spiritually transformative experiences may mimic experiences that get called psychosis in such a way that they can be clinically addressed together. This isn't a new idea. Paris Williams, over a decade ago, raised this idea to abandon differential diagnosis, not seeing it as a compassionate approach, which was backed up by Brian Spittles in his publication in 2022. And he said that psychotic and spiritual experiences are not discrete, but are inextricably interconnected and indiscernible. So for my research, I wanted to dive a bit more into Brian Spittles' PhD study from which this image is taken. He published this book, Psychosis, Psychiatry and Psychospiritual Considerations, in 2022, and it was based on his PhD research in which he contested the topmost differential diagnosis criteria that was created by de Menezes Jr. and Moreira Almeredo in 2009, and that was based on a meta-analysis of all of the papers in the field around differential diagnosis. And on a re-examination of the same literature, Brian Spittles found that all of the criteria raised in the psychosis category also appear within the context of psychospiritual transformation. And so he stated that none of the criteria are effective for diagnostic purposes. And for my study, I wanted to draw particular attention to the criteria highlighted here, that psychospiritual experiences are said to promote personal growth over time, but experiences that are called psychosis lack a developmental nature, because that wasn't what I found from my almost 30 years working in mental health. I spoke to Brian Spittles about the gaps in research, and he said there was a paucity of papers on whether psychosis and spiritual emergency cannot be diagnostically differentiated. So I wanted to focus on how some people find and harness transformative meaning in experiences that have been conceptualized as psychosis by clinical psychiatry. I chose heuristic inquiry for my methodology because I knew I had a strong positionality, and it's a very immersive method which takes a lot of self-reflection. It's a really robust self-reflective process. It's also known to be a suitable method to use when the inquiry is on a cutting edge of new territory being explored, which felt kind of aligned with what I wanted to study. And this hermeneutical meaning-making process is known to advance empowerment, agency, and social justice. Just a bit on my co-researchers. I love the fact also that in heuristics, participants are called co-researchers because it feels more non-hierarchical, and it really kind of honors the wisdom of the co-researchers. It was interesting that there was such a wide background of religious experience within such a small group of people, which kind of gave a real richness to the data. And although I stipulated at least 2 years since diagnosis for ethical reasons, to make sure people kind of as far enough through their turbulent stage as possible. Interestingly enough, most people were at least 10 years post-diagnosis, but 2 people were at least 3 decades, which gave them real wisdom to share with me, which I was so grateful for. So results from my study indicated that all of the co-researchers underwent personal growth, even though they'd been diagnosed with psychosis. And the factors which led to this transformation included, and the themes that I've highlighted in bold here, were awakening to the fact that humans are more than physical beings, that we are deeply interconnected with each other and the world. They also spoke about awakening to the fact that they were kind of wearing this ego facade, as Emma spoke about before, and this kind of false self, this construct that they'd been built up because of wounds, trauma. They also experienced exceptional human experiences, so ESP. They discovered that they had subpersonalities, also due to trauma. And through the experience, they became more self-led. They felt more able to be led by their soul, their higher self. They had improved interpersonal relationships through peer support and connecting with a meaningful life purpose by offering support to others who had gone through similar experiences. I'm just going to share some of the quotes that came from the co-researchers because they're just really lovely and profound. So in terms of awakening, Alan said, "We're part of a multidimensional universe, but when the higher dimension, universal consciousness, hits the 3rd dimension, our physical bodies, our psyches, it's like a ray of light hitting a massive grey diamond, and it gets broken up into lots of little pieces. So that's like the fragmentation of the psyche during these experiences." So in terms of ESP phenomena people experienced, a lot of people talked about accurate telepathy opening up and said that we're living in symbol during these experiences. We're living in a metaphorical universe. It's as if we're in a sea of symbol, and that's the only way that we can communicate when we're really immersed in these experiences. Everything becomes hyper-connected and meaningful. People talked about synchronicities. So there were so many overlaps with what people speak about in spiritual emergence. Tam talked about it was like a door, a million doors had opened to this universal awareness of, and she felt like she knew everything, and that really resonated with my own experience. This image here is from a doodle book that Ruth had in hospital, and she was kind of drawing spirals and symbology that were very spiritual, and she wrote that we're all stars and we're all connected. Dorian talked about what John Weir Perry calls a renewal process, and Jay spoke about a kind of a death of the ego, a death of the old self, which was really resonant to what I was remembering hearing all those years ago on acute psychiatric wards when people said they felt that they were dying. And Anne said that she felt like it was part of an evolutionary process. I'm going to whiz through these, but Tam spoke about finding kind of retrospectively learning about Jungian archetypes and subpersonalities and making sense of her experience in transpersonal ways. Everybody, and this was a theme that came out really organically, and I added this to the interview protocol as a question because everybody was raising it themselves without me asking. Everybody, 100% of the co-researchers said they needed peer support during their experience. They needed someone to listen and hold space without judgment. Dorian said they wanted someone that was curious, that they weren't pressing their worldview on me. And Jay said they wanted someone to sit with them and help them make sense and find meaning in the experience for themselves. Everyone said that their experience, even though it was really challenging and they wouldn't wish it on anyone, it gave them a sense of life purpose. And this really resonated with my own experience. It was like Dorian said, my whole life mission, it became crawling under my skin. It was like my mandate on earth.
1 minute, Katie.
Okay, thank you. So this is a pattern that emerged, which really resonated with my own story. This kind of trajectory of everyone's experience, from childhood trauma to repressing that, to finding that everything was meaningful and connecting. So the results supported Spital's rejection of differential diagnosis. We saw overlaps between mediators of post-traumatic growth after psychosis and the transformative effects of integration after a spiritual emergency. Facilitation of the process, rather than it being suppressed by psychiatric medication, was raised as being really important, which Brooks also raised as the least helpful criteria in her inventory for the integration of spiritually transformative experiences. And it supported Vieten and Scammell's claim that these experiences could potentially be treated together. I want to end with this really powerful quote by Lisa Fannin, and I want to propose that transpersonal psychology has an ethical responsibility to move beyond differential diagnosis towards a more multidisciplinary, transcultural, trauma-informed approach. And being more collaborative with the leading edge of the mental health field, because I think transpersonal psychology can bring such wisdom into the mental health field in terms of understanding consciousness as existing beyond the brain, but that also transpersonal psychology can learn from mental health in terms of how it's moving beyond the diagnostic labels. So all of my co-researchers found liberation for themselves through letting go and dissenting their psychiatric framings. And Lisa Fannin says this is dissent, it's the opposite of consent. It's a refusal to accept psychiatric framings of our experiences because of the limited lens that these offer on consciousness and context. It's a legacy of fractured and reductive Eurocentric philosophy that doesn't speak to the whole of our contextual and relational existence.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you. Gosh, sorry, I could have gone on there. I'll stop sharing.
Katie, that was very informative. I know you had a ton of information to present to us, but you did a great job, and I loved your slides. They were very beautiful. Thank you. Well done. And next, I would like to introduce Colleen DeJoseph on the panel. She will explore the impact of misdiagnosing spiritual experiences as mental illness and carrying on where Katie left off, drawing from doctoral research and survivor testimonials. She examines alternative understanding and challenges psychiatric labels. She is a psychiatric survivor turned transpersonal psychologist. And please help me welcome Colleen DeJoseph.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you all. So my name is Colleen DeJoseph. I am a transpersonal psychologist as well as a psychotherapist. In 2011, I had an anomalous spiritual experience and was unfortunately involuntarily hospitalized. And at the time, there was no doubt that what I was experiencing for myself was a spiritual experience, but I received a pathological label nonetheless. After a week of being in the hospital, when I was released, I just recognized that the doctors really didn't understand the experience that I was going through. And as synchronicity would have it, shortly after that, I came across the field of transpersonal psychology that has been studying experiences like the one I had since the 1960s. So I decided to enter into the field and do some research. And when I was thinking about my dissertation, what I recognized was that there was no representation within the research literature of people like me who had a spiritual experience, came into contact with the mental health system, and received a pathological label and didn't agree with the label that they were given. So my study was the first study to look at what the impact is of having a spiritual experience misdiagnosed by the Western medical model of psychiatry. And to give you a little background, Katie touched a little bit on this. And the term spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency were coined by Christina Graf and Stan Graf, who is a psychiatrist. And spiritual emergency and spiritual emergence are umbrella terms used to define many anomalous experiences as the ones listed here. The different spiritual emergence is when somebody has an experience of a non-ordinary state of consciousness, but it's a gentle expression of that experience. Where spiritual emergency is a bit more complicated, it often comes on suddenly. People are often thrown into new realms of mystical and spiritual experience, for which they often have no reference. So it can cause a lot of confusion. It can be overwhelming and fearful. And it can cause some disruption in functioning in their daily life in some capacity. One of the things that the field of transpersonal psychology has established since developing these terms for these experiences is that these experiences are often catalyzed by significant life stressors and trauma. So transpersonal psychology has been advocating for a trauma-informed lens and conceptualization of these experiences pretty much since its inception. Often when people have an experience as listed here and they happen to come into contact with the medical model, unfortunately, they're often misdiagnosed, typically as suffering from some sort of psychosis, which often leads to, because psychosis is seen as a regressive experience within the world of psychiatry, they define it as a regressive experience that is symptomatic of a greater underlying disease process. So people who experience psychosis are often labeled with bipolar 1, schizoaffective, or schizophrenia disorder. And it's really a shame because according to the American Psychiatric Association, they specifically state to avoid misdiagnosis, cultural variation in symptoms and explanatory models may lead clinicians to misjudge the severity of a problem or assign the wrong diagnosis. And they specifically state that unfamiliar spiritual explanations may be misunderstood as psychosis. The field of transpersonal psychology has been looking at clinical differentiation for decades, mainly an attempt to differentiate those who may benefit from clinical intervention and those who may be harmed by it. So the real motivation is to prevent people from being iatrogenically harmed and being given medication and treatment that may not necessarily be of benefit to them. So according to Dr. Lukoff, back in 1985, he established, it's his opinion, that an absence of conceptual disorganization, an absence of cognitive disabilities or deficits, and an absence of suicidal or homicidal ideation establishes a distinction. Whereas Goretsky hypothesized that those who experience resulting psychopathology are a subgroup of the larger spiritual emergency population who may not possess protective factors. And then Carey did a quantitative study where he operationalized spiritual or religious problem as defined within the DSM, and he determined that diminished affectivity and cognitive dysfunctions discriminated patients with psychosis from individuals with spiritual and religious problems. So my study asks the question, what is the impact of having an anomalous spiritual experience misdiagnosed by the Western medical model of psychiatry? I did an IPA qualitative study, and 4 superordinate themes were elicited from analysis of the data. There were psychological consequences of misdiagnosis, iatrogenic wounding, wrestling with paradox, and honoring the subjective. As I continue on, I'm going to read verbatim from the quotes of my participants, just because qualitative analysis is all about the lived experience and the voices of the participants, and I would like to honor their voices as much as possible. So, psychological consequences of misdiagnosis. Participants expressed that the label became a lens through which their very identity was filtered, and it caused them to lose all credibility with respect to their understanding of their experiences. And so they felt as though they experienced a death of their former self, and they experienced a lot of grief and loss because they lost relationships with close friends and family who chose to prioritize the opinion of the medical doctor over their own understanding of their experience. And reassertion of insight. So, what my participants expressed is that they all had a firm foundational understanding that their experiences were primarily spiritual in nature as they were occurring. But when they received the diagnostic label, it caused them to sort of compare and contrast their understanding of their experience versus what the medical model was saying. And that act of doing so just confirmed their initial insight that their experiences were, in fact, not pathological and were spiritual in nature. So one participant says, I felt this happened when I was 32 years old, and it didn't matter who I had been until that day. From that day on, anything I said was contested. It's like I stopped being who I was, and now I was the mad woman. Another participant, she was a married mother to a small child at the time of her experience. She says, I'm thinking, okay, I have this baby and I'm married to this man who's not from my culture. He could just pick up and leave with the baby, and I'm going to be trapped in the loony house, you know? So I'm like, okay, I'm just going to shut my mouth and I'm going to do whatever they tell me to do. She said, I understood my predicament and discussed how she found solace in recalling the story of when Jesus is on the mount and he's like, he knows he has to die. He says to himself, this is my chalice or my cup, and I will drink it. That's what I said to myself, you know? This is my cup, and I will drink it. So I surrendered. I surrendered to what was going on. And I said, and I will get out of it. I felt annihilated as a person, you know? I felt infantilized. I felt like I didn't have a say over my own life. I felt stigmatized. I felt broken. Another participant expressed how the psychiatric intervention she received left her like a shadow of her former self, like completely done over, like panic attacks, fat, heavy medicated, and how expressing to the psychiatrist that what she was experiencing was a spiritual experience was akin to digging myself a grave because you're not given any credit for that. That's just no insight. Iatrogenic wounding. So participants cited the pathological labeling, the psychiatric medications, and the mistreatment by hospital staff as being responsible for an exacerbation and distortion of their subjective experiences. They specifically drew a link between the psychiatric medication, usually neuroleptics, the ingestion of that, and their subjective experiences becoming exacerbated, so that those that were positive became scary, and those that were scary became even more so. They also expressed a sense of betrayal and disappointment for how they were treated, and they all unanimously expressed that what they needed most at the time of their experiences was to be in a safe and compassionate environment with empathetic caregivers, with one participant stating that he needed to have what monks have. The mistreatment, neglect, and mischaracterization of their experiences as being symptomatic of pathology was for participants predominantly a symptom of mental health professionals and the psychiatric system's own arrested development and their inability and refusal to recognize their own limitations and biases to the detriment of their patients, which left my participants with nowhere to turn. As one participant expressed, I get to the hospital and I just said, I had this outlier neurobiological event. It's totally weird, you know? I know that I'm talking fast, but you guys, you know, you're doctors. You're here for me. I was so full of trust. I was like, you're going to help me because you're going to listen to what I'm saying, and you're gonna know, because you're healthcare professionals, that there's crazy and then there's like weird shit. Like the dude from the Oliver Sacks books who got hit by lightning, and then he could just play the piano. And I had such full faith. So I just went in there being completely honest. And they were just like, no, it's in your head. This doesn't exist. And I was like, oh shit. And then I realized that's one flew over the cuckoo's nest. There was no like, I couldn't have done any better. I couldn't have put it in more scientific language. Participants also expressed frustration with religious faith leaders. One participant said, when I read about like the descriptions of stream entry, which is from the Buddhist tradition, and the descriptions of mania, it's like, oh my God, you're talking about the same thing. And if you integrate this in a good way, then it's all like peace and love and stuff. And I've never been happier. But if you let the psychiatrist tell you what you are, it's like a form of, we're just hypnotizing ourselves into feeling like a person anyway. He goes on to say, I haven't found anything that explains it better than Buddhism. But even it's like not Buddhism with the answer. It's like this is what can happen. And eventually science will get there, but it's not there. I look at the Buddhists and I'm like, why the fuck aren't you doing something? Like, am I seriously the only person seeing this? Obviously not. But like, what's my avenue? And then another participant said, faith leaders are the biggest hypocrites you've ever met. When you go and tell them you're having a spiritual experience, they just tell you to go see a doctor. It's like, what? What's going down? And you're talking about heaven and hell. And if I'm going to have an experience that's giving me dark and light forces, you're going to tell me I'm mentally ill? It's crazy. So one woman spoke about being completely isolated in her experience, and she said, I was having not only at the hospital, the whole year I kept having ideas. I kept having anxieties. I kept having ideas, like synchronicities, maybe very dulled, but they were still happening. I just couldn't talk to anybody because then they would give me more medication. I was afraid that if I said anything, I was going to end up in the hospital again. Another participant expressed how he is seriously fucked because of the mental health community's refusal to even acknowledge that non-dual states of consciousness are real. The iatrogenesis of that is like trying to find an actual therapist who I can go to now, who can talk about this shit with me, because I'm like, okay, I'm neurodivergent, traumatized, drug issues, and I don't need to talk about this non-dual shit. But if you won't even acknowledge that it exists, then I know that you're just waiting to tell me that I'm delusional. So wrestling with paradox. Um, Participants express understanding why and how the psychiatrists would ascribe the labels that they did. But what they argued was that the label is a reflection of psychiatry's inability to recognize and make sense of the validity of any anomalous phenomena outside of the five senses materialistic worldview, and that there was significant divergences from the diagnostic criteria from how they presented that went overlooked by the doctors diagnosing them. And one participant expressed that there was a lack of cultural humility on the part of the doctors, who ignored him when he said that his behavior that got him hospitalized was aligned with his religious tradition. So what participants argued was that a divergence from the label is paramount because their experiences aren't pathological and not indicative of lifelong illness. And so the pathological label simply doesn't apply. So I had two participants who used the term psychosis interchangeably as I was interviewing them. And I asked them why. And one participant was a Nigerian American, and he said that his use of the word psychosis was a pragmatic compromise and a means of self-protection, considering that he's a Black man living in North America. He says, I wish there was a world where I could just express it as a religious experience, but he recognizes that he is in a Black body that tends to be punished for those kinds of deviance. He explained, I kind of interpret it as like, honestly, as a Black body. It's like I have a choice between juridical things, like being criminalized, or, like pick whichever mental disorder you want to accept. And that's been my experience. Another participant said, okay, so I'm giving you the technical name when she calls it psychosis, but who's the expert? The person who lived it or the doctors, okay? You have to, at some point, you should say, you know what? This lady calls it an awakening. We should understand that's what it actually is. So honoring the subjective. what participants argued was that their experiences are expressions of healing from trauma, and certainly not pathological. And they expressed that they were tremendously impactful in expanding their sense of self, their perception of the world, and shifting their priorities. And it was also a almost insatiable call to social justice to change how these experiences are conceptualized within the medical model, and to prevent people from being needlessly pathologized. So, materialistic bypass. One
Colleen,
participant
1 minute,
argued that
please.
the
This is
pathologizing of subjective anomalous spiritual experiences is symptomatic of society's spiritual bankruptcy and its overwhelming tendency to be oppressively rationalist and too invested in scientism. This idea that, like, nope, the way you know stuff is through evidence to the exclusion of the validity of spiritual experiences, subjective spiritual experiences. And he says they're literally mistaking healing for sickness, literally. One participant said, I listened to like Ram Dass and Joseph Goldstein and this kind of stuff before and read Eckhart Tolle or whatever. But now I read it, like my understanding, my comprehension of it changed in an instant. I'm like, oh, that's a pretty good way to try to put it. Like, yeah, I've seen that shit too. Like, like we didn't just make up God to fool each other. I'm way more inclined to believe in like vibrations and dharma and like the Tao. I've never really believed anything before. I've not believed stuff and then I thought stuff is true. That makes sense. But now I kind of believe that, like, yeah, if you got really advanced, you could walk on water. You can really bend reality with your mind. Like, you can really manifest stuff, but we're not pure enough right now. Now I kind of believe in magic more. Another participant said, it changed me and it changed my concept of what is real and what is not. I definitely am a different person.
Colleen, we have to wrap
Yeah.
up, please.
Oh, okay. I was pretty much done anyway. Just with the clinical implications, there is an importance and a need for greater clinical utilization of the V code, religious or spiritual problem. And there's also a need for a primary diagnostic category of spiritual emergency to be added to future editions of the DSM, as long as the psychiatric hospital remains the first point of contact for people experiencing spiritual emergencies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of this insight. It's been a deep awareness of the misdiagnosis that is occurring. And we'd like to move now into someone that I really enjoyed hearing last year. Brent Spirit is back with us. Thank you, Brent, for joining us. He's speaking about Kundalini awakening, but a global phenomena. So that answers some of the questions that we heard earlier about why this is all happening. And Brent's going to delve into that. He is a spiritual teacher and psychotherapist and host of the Spiritual Awakening Show, founder of KundaliniAwareness.org, and offers support for those going through Kundalini, Shakti awakening, and spiritual emergence. Please welcome Brent.
Great. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to the Spiritual Awakenings International team as well for this opportunity. Today, I'll be speaking about Kundalini Shakti awakening as a global phenomenon. So, on the heels of our previous presenters who have explored spiritual emergence, Emma Bragdon as well gave us a fantastic overview and deep dive into Kundalini awakening. So I appreciate that. It gives me a chance to kind of fly through this a little bit and get into some of the different ways that this shows up around the world. So I'll give my brief, very sort of general working definition of Kundalini Shakti awakening. In my work and my exploration, I've found that, no matter who you talk to who has had these experiences, you're going to hear something a little different from everyone about how they would define this process. So I like to say that it's a divine spiritual force that lies dormant, coiled up at the base of the spine in most human beings, awaiting to be awakened. Very general, loose way of looking at it. Now, once this energy of Kundalini Shakti is awakened, begins to carry out a transformation of consciousness upon the entire body, mind, spirit system of the human being. So this, of course, is the way that the yogis of India would describe this process, using this language of Kundalini Shakti and this concept, this model of the Kundalini Shakti awakening process. Of course, this is one of the most popular terms that we have, Kundalini. It's sort of entering the mainstream in a sense. Many people are having these experiences, and this term Kundalini is sometimes the first touch point that they make. However, it's not the only way that this process has been described. So we can see that there's one fire, many flames. And as I was describing, spiritual awakening is a full body transformation, a whole being transformation involving the body, the mind, the spirit as well. So some may conceive of religious or spiritual practice as being solely something that occurs on the level of the mind, as if it's something to do with belief only, or philosophy, or some degree of knowledge on the level of the mind. And of course, this is all important and valid, but often what's overlooked is that genuine, valid spiritual transformation involves changes occurring within the entire system, particularly within the body. And because a lot of the phenomena can occur within the body that isn't often talked about or discussed, it can be very confusing, very challenging, and it can stir up all sorts of difficult sensations that without proper context can be quite confusing to navigate. So we'll look today a little bit about how this process of a full body transformation shows up around the world. So the reason this conversation matters, like the previous presenters were speaking so insightfully about how many are going through such transformations or experiences, and they're often mistreated, misdiagnosed, mislabeled. It's really, really challenging. And, I went through my own spiritual emergence back in 2012. I could say spiritual emergency, actually. And fortunately, by grace, I was just barely able to make it without being too traumatized. But, it breaks my heart when I hear of people being really, mistreated because their experiences are not properly understood. And so the reason this conversation matters today is because around the world, so many people are experiencing these phenomena, these transformations, these awakenings, and they're not necessarily situated within a particular spiritual or religious system or context. They don't necessarily belong to a lineage or a tradition, or they're not working with very advanced, developed teachers. They maybe are just practicing based on things they read in books or YouTube videos or podcasts, or maybe a friend just says, hey, come with me to a yoga class. And, yoga can trigger a significant awakening or a breathwork experience or a psychedelic experience. And so there's so many people having these experiences at this time on the planet. There's so many different factors that will contribute to our, accelerated ascension, our collective awakening that's taking place. But without proper context, people can be really confused about what's happening to them on the level of their psyche, their spirit, and of course, their body as well. So having cross-cultural understanding will bring validation to others to say, hey, I'm not the only one experiencing this. This isn't solely a yogic thing. This is a global phenomena. It's been explored, discussed, mapped out throughout the world. And this can, of course, bring a person to a state of feeling a little bit more grounded. In some cases, it can humble a person if they've gotten a little too grandiose, feeling that perhaps they're the only person to ever experience this, or one of very few people to ever experience such profound shifts in consciousness. So we can see that there are many of us, virtually all of us here today are on this path as well. So we'll remember, many paths, one source. So across the traditions, there's some shared themes that we can see, some general themes that show up often. And one of them, of course, is this idea of inner fire in the body, inner fire, inner heat, light, divine heat. These are all common ways that people describe the transformation of consciousness occurring within their body. So some will describe Kundalini as being this heat, this inner heat. They can bring a lot of heat. They'd be actually quite uncomfortable at times. As well, people will describe a force and energy moving through the spine. Within yoga, of course, we see this as the Sushumna Nadi up the spinal column, along which the 7 major chakras or energy centers are situated. But of course, this is not the only way of looking at this process. That's just one system. Along with this process, there can be great bliss, great ecstasy, great experiences of divine love, interconnectedness. But prior to that, and sometimes intermittently, there's a period of purification, of a release of trauma, of conditioning. The yogis may refer to it as the burning up of karma, in a sense. And this can be very challenging, very confusing, especially if it's happening without proper context or a deep understanding of what's happening. There's sometimes crises. And of course, through this, fortunately, it leads to rebirth, renewal, resurrection, if you will. So there's these general themes of the immanent within the body, seeking union with the transcendent. Another way of looking at this is the feminine and the masculine coming together into a state of union. And of course, across the board, we see this general beautiful theme of moving out of a sense of separate sense of self or ego into a state of union, interconnectedness, oneness, which brings about all the beautiful things: love, joy, interconnectedness, compassion, the inclination towards service as well. So let's go through some of the traditions around the world and see how this shows up in ways that maybe are not so obvious. So Buddhism in general doesn't really talk so much about this energetic process so openly. However, Tibetan Buddhism does definitely address this with the practice of tumo or dumo, which is the cultivation of an inner fire within the body, which is said to support a person to their enlightenment, right? So they describe certain winds, energetic winds moving through the spinal column, through the central channel. So if you see here, my picture here depicts a snake above the Buddha. This is sometimes we see this every now and then. Sometimes there's a seven-headed serpent as well, representing the seven chakras, but there's many different interpretations of the snake. One of them can be the rising of the Kundalini. Emma Bragdon earlier had mentioned Vipassana practice, very popular Buddhist practice. Vipassana meaning, of course, observing reality as it is. Some of the most common courses for meditation are offered by ISEN Goenka around the world. Many of us may have attended some of those courses. And they don't speak so much, if at all, about energy or Kundalini. However, on my recent course, I paid very close attention to the instructions. And on day 9, the instructions invite the practitioners to become very aware of the spinal column and to begin to move up and down with our awareness, noticing any blockages, allowing electricity or energy to flow in this area. They don't mention anything about Kundalini. They don't mention anything about inner heat or what may happen as the body goes through this transformation, though they do invite practitioners to begin engaging in such an intense and direct practice. And so I've encountered many who go to these retreats or these courses, have a profound energetic opening or Kundalini awakening, if you will, and aren't properly supported. For myself, back in 2012, I attended my first retreat. I came back and I practiced very intensely. I was a good practitioner for 6 months. And then suddenly I had a spiritual emergency, which was entirely energetic. And I didn't have any context for what had happened to me because within the Vipassana practice, they didn't discuss it, right? It's there in Zen as well. It's not talked about so much, but I've encountered a few people who have been very serious practitioners of Zen who begin to have energetic phenomena unfolding within their body, and they become quite confused at times. It can be very challenging. There is some consideration of this. I don't want to be too critical. Of course, there's some great teachers out there that are able to support their students, right, within the Buddhist traditions. Particularly in the Rinzai Zen school, there is a great consideration of energy there. However, in general, it's not as directly spoken about as it is within yoga. Within the mystical tradition of Judaism and the Kabbalah, there's the notion of the Shekinah, or the Shekinah refers to the indwelling or the immanent aspect of God within the human vessel. And its intention is that it moves through the tree of life, through the Sephiroth, which seems similar to the notion of chakras, energy centers within the body. Its aim is to, of course, unite heaven and earth, to bring a person into a state of union with God. So practitioners may report experiencing this presence of God within the system, within the space, with the Shekinah during spiritual practice, whether that's deep prayer, study of texts, or being in a sacred space, for example. Now, before I continue, I was meaning to make this point. I don't want to minimize all of these great, rich traditions and just say they're all the same. They're all talking about the same exact thing. I want to honor that they do come out of deep cultural contexts and serve very specific purposes, and they're all beautiful in their own right. But as I zoom out, I'd like to see that there are certain themes here that I think can be very helpful to validate those who may be confused about what's happening to their body and their system as they go through spiritual awakening or transformation. So with that said, it's there in Christianity as well, right? Christian mysticism, there's this notion of the holy fire, right? That heat once again showing up there. So Saint Teresa of Avila, she describes in her autobiographical take of her spiritual transformation, it's entirely somatic. What she's describing is a transformation happening in her body. It's not just faith or belief in her mind. It's something unfolding within her body, bringing her into these states of ecstasy through great purification and suffering, right? And so she describes that an angel pierced her heart with a fiery spear. So some could report this as the awakening of the heart chakra, the activation of the heart chakra. St. John of the Cross mentioned earlier today as well, right? I believe he has a text referring to the living flame of love, right? It's alive. It's alive within the body, right? As this heat of love. So some may make the connection between the Holy Spirit and the Kundalini in this way. And so I've heard from a few people who are very dedicated, devout Christian practitioners who report being transformed within their body by a force that they refer to as the Holy Spirit. One gentleman spoke to me about how it moved through his spine and he made a great contact with Christ, right? There was great experience of connection with Christ in the midst of his experience. So I see this as akin to the Kundalini process, though different language, different symbols, different archetypes, of course. It's there in Sufism as well, right? The fire of love is there. They describe it as, love's fire in the heart. There's an interesting idea in Sufism. It's not too well known, but the idea of the Lataf, which are subtle spiritual centers, energetic centers within the body, very similar. Though I don't want to say they're the same, but very similar to the notion of the chakras. Once again, it shows up. There's an energetic component within the body associated with spiritual transformation. And so our beloved Rumi, a poem, a prayer here, he says, "Let the fire of your love burn my sorrow and purify my soul so I can fly without wings." Right? To me, he's inviting the divine to purify him within his body with that fire, with that heat, so that he can fly without wings. And of course, poetically describing, at least in my interpretation, union with the divine, right? Union with the divine. The Sufis, not all, though some sects of Sufis will engage in the bodily practice of whirling, right? Spinning. This is engaging in a somatic practice which supports the system to be able to connect with the divine, right? To go into those intoxicated states of consciousness, right? To lead to that purified state where one can really be in connection with the divine. So the Kung people of the Kalahari in Africa have this notion of the Num energy, and I may be pronouncing this incorrectly, the Num energy. They stirred up through a trance dance. And so there's an interesting book by Richard Katz referring to boiling energy. Once again, there's this notion of heat, right? Heat. And so one of the Kalahari Bushmen described, you dance, dance, dance. Then Num lifts you up in your belly and lifts you up in your back. And then you start to shiver. It makes you tremble. It's hot. So once again, there are these themes of an entire bodily transformation or process unfolding that's utterly spiritual, right? It causes heat, shaking. Earlier, Emma was speaking about people having shaking, jerking, right? Sometimes referred to as kriyas, during which the body is releasing and energetic channels are opening up, right? Sometimes people go into these states, they experience visions, they tap into the ability to heal themselves and others as well. And this is something that we do observe as people go through spiritual transformation in general. Kundalini awakening in particular can lead a person to developing certain skills in this sense. It's there in shamanism as well, as we know shamanism being the oldest spiritual tradition or practice or path in the world. There's this notion of shamanic illness, of course, akin to this notion of spiritual emergency. And there's the idea of madness as being a sacred process, right? So what we may refer to as madness today, those who understand shamanism would say, we have a shaman in the making here. How can we support them through their process? Once again, these notions of purification by fire, visionary experiences, emotional upheaval comes about, very similar once again to intense Kundalini awakenings. And the same spiritual energy initially serves to transform an individual, and then that same energy serves to serve. I really love Sri Ramana Maharshi, and I just note that even in his story, there's this notion of the energetic process transforming his entire system. It's not often talked about, and so I chose to highlight it here today. Directly from his Wikipedia page, there's this line here. At the age of 16, he had a depth experience in which he became aware of a current or force which he recognized as his true I or self. So I believe this is a notion that's often overlooked by those exploring Advaita Vedanta, who may put a lot of emphasis on self-inquiry without really taking note that there was an energetic process that unfolded in Sri Ramana's awakening, right? There was a current, a force, a current, an electric current, an energetic current. And so though he didn't teach explicitly about Kundalini, he didn't use this language too often. Somebody did ask him at one point, what is Kundalini? He said, Kundalini is another name for the self. And in another instance, he says, when you realize the self and you abide as a self, the Kundalini will rise on its own. So still, there is an energetic component even in Sri Ramana's paradigm. And if we come over to modern times here in the West, Carl Jung, of course, also acknowledged the validity of Kundalini awakening. He gave some great seminars on it. He was very interested in the East and yoga. And he described Kundalini as a symbol of individuation that can awaken unconscious archetypes. So sometimes people going through this process will have a lot of unconscious archetypal material beginning to arise that can teach them, that can represent what is unfolding for them, that can be very insightful. But of course, without proper context, it can appear as what we may refer to as psychosis, or somebody going completely mad with their visions and whatnot. But these are known processes that, if properly supported, can really help a person to develop, right? And so Carl Jung said, you see, the Kundalini, in psychological terms, is that which makes you go on the greatest adventures. And I can think of no greater adventure than this process. And so spiritual transformation, of course, is a universal human process. As you've seen, there are many valid paths. This weekend, we've got so many speaking from different paths and traditions and journeys, validating this idea. And so I invite everybody to draw from what resonates with you as you go on your journey, without being too harshly critical of things that don't. Because in my opinion, it seems that at the center of all of these traditions is the same energetic process unfolding within the system, just discussed with different symbols, different constructs, different ideas, but really expressing the same thing. So with that said, you can know you're not alone. The challenges and the gifts of spiritual awakening have been documented across cultures, across the world, throughout history. So in my efforts to support those going through this process who may feel confused, I have created KundaliniAwareness.org. We have a directory of licensed mental health professionals with direct Kundalini awakening experience themselves. Perhaps Kundalini is maybe too specific of a term, with spiritual emergence experience themselves. And we've got a collection of stories. We're hosting a global Kundalini meditation. We've got some various peer support groups listed there as well. And so this is my attempt to contribute a bit to resolving these challenges that we've been speaking about today, where people are being mistreated despite going through valid, genuine spiritual transformations that can really change the world if they are supported. And so if you'd like to learn more about myself and my work, brentspirit.com. I've got some free material, free events, free group meetings with the community, all of us going through this process together, supporting one another. Got some interviews on my YouTube channel with others that have gone through this process as well. You can check it all out, and I will wrap there. Thank you all so much for giving me your time and attention today.
Oh, thank you, Brent. We appreciated this. The entire panel has been fascinating. Some of the questions that we've had have been more responses on a personal level. But Brent, I wanted to ask you, you previously said that your beginning in this field began when you were really young. Can you just tell us very briefly, because we only have about 10 minutes to finish up, but can you tell us, as the first of the panelists to speak, briefly what you experienced that opened this door for you?
Yeah, so I was very young. I was very depressed and anxious during my teenage years at age 15. And I heard about this thing called meditation. And so I thought, why don't I try this? Maybe I'll, calm my mind down and just feel a little better. And when I sat to meditate, the moment I closed my eyes, I began to experience spontaneous movements in my spine. My body began to react and respond to this meditation really intensely. And I didn't know what was happening. I was very spooked, very confused. It felt as if I was possessed. And so that was the beginning of this. Following that, I would continue to explore, but it was quite challenging because I was firstly just a kid, no real support. I was just really winging it. And looking back, if I had proper support, I think it could have gone a lot smoother. But this is how the path unfolded, I guess.
Thank you. That seems to be a message that we've heard over and over again, starting with Emma talking about it as the support group that you're in. I'd like to ask Colleen, from the time that you had what you described as your psychiatric event where you see yourself as a survivor, to you began to truly feel balanced in a way that allowed you to function better in the world. What is the length of time there? Can you define that for us?
It's interesting because at the time of my hospitalization, there was no problems with my functioning. I would argue I was actually functioning greater than I had been prior to the experience.
Interesting. And Katie, could you address the same concept? Someone wanted to know that they said typical link in your research that you saw between having a spiritually transformative event that may have been a bit out of balance or misdiagnosed because it brought attention to itself, and meaningful balance in one's life.
It's really difficult to give like an overall answer for everyone because everybody has an individual path. But I know there is research within the Spiritual Crisis Network that says the integration journey can take around 10 years. That's kind of an average for people to feel really grounded, I think, and integrated after their experience. Up to 10 years.
Very good. Thank you.
Be gentle with yourself if it's new. That's kind of what we say. Yeah.
Very good. And that leads us to the end of our questionings, except we're going to give everybody a chance to respond to exactly what Katie just said. What would be the one best piece of advice that you have for everyone who's going through spiritually transformative events? And we'll go to you, Colleen, for this answer.
I would say find somebody that you really trust to confide in, who can really help hold that space with you, and to really ground and take care of yourself throughout.
Very good. To each of you, there are people who are asking to be in touch with you personally, and I know that you have organizations that would fit in. If you could just add that information to the chat, that would be great. They're also asking about your slides, and they've all complimented you tremendously. Brent, so to close our Q&A today, what would be your most important piece of advice that you would give to others going through spiritually transformative experiences?
Yeah, well, Colleen took my answer. I would say find the others. And so on top of that, I would say really just supporting this system with very simple, basic self-care that we all know about. Eating well, sleeping well, engaging in spiritual practice gently, social connection, very important as well, and allowing the body to do what it knows how to do. We're wired for this. If we just support our system, it can be quite smooth.
Based on that, one last perspective is, if we're wired for this, and it is natural to human beings to go through this, even back to Emma, I wondered about that. What causes the break that occurs where you end up in something that others would call a psychotic episode? What causes that, Katie, from your perspective?
I mean, that's a huge question to end on. I have my own hypothesis, but I might be wrong. But I think there is a correlation between the age that someone has a trauma and how the experience manifests. I do think it's a natural thing that every human has a propensity for. But I think if we've experienced trauma when the certain aspects of the brain are developing, then we have a higher propensity to go into altered states and maybe also stay in them. which is why I think it needs to be handled so much more compassionately. And I'd also echo what Colleen and Brent said around finding validation and slowing things down, being really kind to ourselves, and basic needs: sleeping, eating well, and finding trusted peers is what we need. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. Brent, one last question just popped up for you, and I think we have time for it. Would you say Jesus had a Kundalini experience as he resurrected? Do you feel qualified to speak to that?
I don't know if I'm qualified to speak to it, but I have a great suspicion that all spiritual transformation or spiritual process involves some degree of Kundalini transformation. I haven't come across anybody who's had any significant spiritually transformative experiences that didn't have some Kundalini themes unfolding as well. And so I don't think Jesus would be an exception, but of course, this is just my opinion.
Well, you also seem to group many things together. And do you believe that all spiritually transformative experiences have at their core this element of the Kundalini?
I believe so. I think this is also what's going on with near-death experiences as well. This is perhaps an oversimplification of it, but I find that this has been effective for me in supporting others, because otherwise it just gets very complicated. And the things I share are very simple, regardless of really what's happening in your spiritual awakening process. Really being gentle with yourself, taking care of yourself, following your intuition, some connection with the higher power. It seems to be universally applicable, but I'm a very simple person, and it may not be for everyone.
Well, I love that emphasis on the basics, like getting plenty of rest and eating good food and keeping yourself in balance. That was great. You described, Brent, this is a global phenomenon that's occurring. Spiritual Awakenings International would certainly be proof of that, because this organization is growing like wildfire all over the world. And do you also agree, Katie, that this phenomena is now just bursting at the seams on an international level?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that in the same way that an individual process is kind of a crisis towards healing, I feel like we're in this kind of meta crisis, meta awakening, in order to move away from the patriarchal, capitalist ways of being that we're killing ourselves with. I think we're in this kind of, meta spiritual awakening for the world, because we need to save ourselves and the planet, basically.
And allow spirituality to become in the forefront. Beautiful. And Colleen, do you agree about this spiritual awakening being a global phenomenon? Have you experienced that in your research?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the fact that we now have access to cross-cultural access is really significant in that regard too, where a lot of people are experimenting with different religious and spiritual traditions in a real experiential way.
Very good. Well, I want to thank all of you. It was a fascinating panel, and on many levels, it's very personal, the things that you shared, and we really appreciate that. Obviously, in your careers, you've also put yourself on a line on a very personal level, but that level of service is greatly appreciated by others who are going through their own experiences. So thank all of you so very much.